A cloud of suspicion has hung over Sarasota County, Florida residents for over 50 years now, thanks to a homicide that rocked the community in December of 1959. Accusations and judgments flew as, one by one, families began locking their doors at night. Sarasota County became a place of sullen whispers and dark rumors almost overnight. Cold stares and pointed fingers continue to plague the community to this day. And while most people believe that DNA testing can close cold cases with ease in our modern era, the truth is quite a bit more complicated. There are limitations to what DNA can accomplish, especially in older cases like this one. DNA is not the magic bullet that so many wish it could be, as you will soon learn. Our over-reliance on the tool may keep cases like this one from getting closed, despite other credible evidence linking murderers to their crime. Join me for the story of the Walker family murders, the tragic tale of a vibrant young family cut down in their prime. It's a murder mystery that might well be linked to a famous true crime story published as both a nonfiction book and a movie. Come along with me for a ride through odd, strange, and mysterious here at Odd Mysteries Stories. Cliff Walker, aged 24, lived in a small clapboard house with his wife, Christine. Also aged 24, their son, Jimmy, aged 3, and their daughter, Debbie, at just 23 months old. Cliff was a cowboy in the truest sense of the word, working as a ranch hand and drawing a modest salary. The family was poor, yet frugal, making the most of Cliff's small salary. They were a happy, friendly couple who lived a simple life in a simple time. Their home on the southern tip of the Palmer Ranch in Osprey, Florida, was isolated. The nearest neighbor lived half a mile away. When death came for this family, there was no one to hear, and not anyone near enough to help them. By December 19, 1959, the Walkers had added a few Christmas decorations to their home and had placed wrapped packages under the tree for their children. They loaded the kids into their 1952 Plymouth and headed into town in the hopes of trading their old car for a newer model. Yet, when they returned home, it would be in the same car they'd left in, because none of the models they'd test-driven that day met either their needs or their budget. They made the most of the day, though. They ran a few errands, picking up groceries and some cattle feed, and then stopped at the ranch where they met up with Cliff's friend, fellow ranch hand Don McLeod, and Don's wife. Cliff and Don spoke about their upcoming plans to go hunting. Christine, bubbly and spirited, socialized briefly with Don's wife. Then she drove back to their house by herself, humoring the children, who wished to go home with their daddy in his work jeep. Cliff and Don talked a bit longer, finalizing their plans to go hog hunting the following morning. A half hour later, Cliff and the kids followed Christine home. Had Cliff lingered to chat for just a few minutes longer, it's possible that he and the children might have survived that terrible day. Instead, he most likely arrived home to a crime in progress, the rape and murder of his wife. She was likely either unconscious or dead already, and soon he and the children would fall victim as well, at the hands of an expert gunman armed with 2 different .22 caliber handguns. Don arrived at the Walker home for his planned hunting outing on the morning of December 20th. He first became alarmed when he couldn't rouse the family, so he used his pocket knife to slash the screen door and pop the lock on the family home, before stepping inside. Seeing Christine's bare feet and a lot of blood, he stumbled back in shock. Then he charged a half-mile up the road to the nearest phone so he could summon the police. None of this stopped Don from becoming a suspect in the murder himself, but he was eventually cleared. Police arrived at the scene to find Christine barefoot, bruised and bloody. She was wearing a pink floral dress that was pulled up toward her chest. Though police would initially deny that Christine was raped, physical evidence would soon say otherwise. After the killer finished with her, he shot her to death twice, using 2 different handguns. Cliff was still wearing his cowboy hat when the murderer shot him in the right eye, indicating perhaps that he'd only just entered the house. Little Jimmy Walker was curled up next to him. Except for the blood and the 3 bullet wounds piercing his young flesh, he might have appeared to be asleep. The killer shot 24-month-old Debbie Walker in the bathtub. He then ran 4 inches of water to make sure she'd drown. It's not clear why the killer thought it necessary to do this. Debbie likely would have bled out. Perhaps the killer considered leaving her alive, since she was too young to have been capable of identifying him. But he may have had second thoughts about her worth as a witness, if she knew him well enough to call out his name sometime during the brutal murder spree. Police collected a bloody boot print from the scene of the crime, some fingerprints, bullet casings, and a partial bloody handprint on the bathroom faucet. They also found Christine's suede pump shoes. The heels were splattered in blood, indicating Christine had not only used them to fight back, but had scored at least one solid hit against her attacker before he got the better of her. A few items had been taken from the scene, but only a few. The killer took $18 in cash, which would be the equivalent of a little under $200 in today's money. He took the couple's marriage certificate and Christine's favorite dance uniform from high school. Cliff's pocket knife was also missing. The killer may have also taken some of the family's Christmas presents. But if that is the case, he only took some and left others behind. A strange move for a person who had decided to take any at all. As isolated as the home was, the killer would have had plenty of time to load up his car with anything he wanted. The murder weapons have never been found. Unfortunately, many of the crime scene protocols we're familiar with today weren't in force in 1959. Police swarmed the home and driveway. Some parked close enough to the house to eliminate tread evidence of the killer's vehicle. One of the officers themselves might have accidentally stepped in the blood, enough to become the source of the boot print at the scene. Nevertheless, the lead investigator on the case, Sarasota Sheriff Ross Boyer, used every tool at his disposal to try to find the killer. By the time the investigation was complete, his department would run 2,920 fingerprint comparisons and would conduct ballistic testing on more than 75 guns. They would interview around 500 suspects. At times, they were hampered by false confessions, bad tips, and repeated attempts to smear the good name of nearly everyone involved, including Christine Walker herself. But to the best of their ability at the time, they left no stone unturned. They even issued notices in the local paper, warning people to look out for men with suspicious cuts on their faces. It looked a lot like Christine had known the killer. 3 dogs in the yard hadn't stopped the killer or raised suspicion by barking, perhaps indicating they recognized him. The Walker's Plymouth was parked in the wrong spot, possibly indicating that Christine returned home to a visitor in her regular parking spot. From the evidence at the scene, she apparently let the killer inside the house. She'd hung up her purse and had gotten some groceries put away before it began, perhaps indicating a little friendly small talk was in progress before the murders. After matching the shell casings to the bullet wounds, Boyer realized that the killer hadn't missed even a single shot. He concluded they were looking for a local man who was an expert marksman. Many decades later, one cold case detective would present a very different theory. You're going to be shocked to hear who else might have committed these crimes. Christine was a stunning woman with curly brown hair and said to have a figure much like that of Marilyn Monroe's. She also lived among ranch hands and local boys, many of whom would get drunk and attempt to sexually harass her. Cliff would often get into fights attempting to defend her. On the night of the murders, at least 7 of these routine harassers were fishing at a nearby creek. Another 3 were seen drinking on the road leading to the Walker's house. Any one of them might have had the motive and the means, as gun ownership in the rural South was just as common back then as it is today. If any of them had rape on their mind and spotted Christine driving alone without her husband and children, then any one of them might have decided he was looking at a prime opportunity. It's possible one of these men impulsively followed Christine home and attacked. But there are a few problems with this theory. The men who mistreated Christine to the point that Cliff needed to fight them off probably would not have been invited in to chat while Christine unloaded groceries. She probably wouldn't have felt comfortable turning her back on any of them. In addition, while all 10 of these men were interviewed and investigated, the police couldn't definitively place any of them at the scene of the crime. In fact, as they were spending time together in groups, they might well have all been one another's alibis. Do you think it's possible that Christine would have been willing to let one of these rough men inside of her home? Do you believe that some of the men lied to cover up a suspicious absence of one of their number from the fishing hole? Or do you think these were merely minor menaces who were coincidentally close to the scene of this tragic crime? One of Christine's unwanted pursuers was a little different from the rough and rowdy men that Christine and Cliff sometimes encountered within the community. Wilbur Tooker was a 65-year-old railroad worker and violinist of questionable talent. He kept showing up at the house to make advances on Christine. They were advances which she rebuffed multiple times. Could her rejection have spurred Tooker to murder? While the motive is there, police found that Tooker had at least a partial alibi. He'd been playing violin at a local concert in Bradenton that night during the most probable time of the crime. His conductor backed the alibi with sour complaints about Tooker's performance. This theory also suffers from the same problem as the rough men theory. While there's a chance Christine might have written Tooker off as harmless, it seems unlikely she would have let herself be alone in the house with him, even if she didn't see him as a threat. Such a move might have had a negative impact on her reputation, something she would probably have been careful to protect. Are you satisfied with Tooker's alibi? Do you think Christine's sense of etiquette would have overridden her sense of self-preservation? Or do you think Walter Tooker may have committed the crime? If so, how did he get back from the concert in time to find out Christine was home alone? If he was the culprit, Wilbur Tooker is beyond justice now. He died 4 years after the Walker murders of a heart attack in 1963. Upon learning of the murders, a man named Elbert Walker, who is Cliff's cousin, became hysterical. Later, he fainted at the funeral. The police believed his behavior to be unusual. It was certainly out of keeping with the social norms for men of the day. But today we understand such displays are indeed a standard range of grief responses. Nevertheless, police uncovered a rumor that Elbert held a deep love for Christine, despite her utter devotion to Cliff. Remember, the killer took the couple's marriage certificate, as well as Christine's favorite majorette uniform. Removing these items certainly seems intimate and personal, like the kind of thing a person might take if they had just killed the object of their unrequited love. In addition, it seems plausible that Christine would invite a family member inside the house to chat while she put the groceries away and waited for Cliff, and the dogs would have recognized Elbert as well. Of course, police never matched bullet casings to any gun Elbert owned, could not get a fingerprint match, and weren't able to match his DNA, nor did they ever find the marriage certificate or the uniform among his belongings. Elbert is still alive, though elderly, and so he is eligible for arrest if police ever successfully link him to the crime. He's also happily married. Elbert offers an entirely different reason for his reaction. He said that he and Cliff were as close as brothers. He also denies that he ever had feelings for Christine. His attitude toward the public's lingering suspicion seems to be one of quiet resignation. Do you think Elbert really loved Christine from afar? Could this love turn to hatred strong enough to slaughter his own close kin? Or was the suspicion cast upon him merely the product of the small-town rumor mill? The fourth theory is perhaps the strongest, though it still has some problems, and not everyone is convinced by it. Most of you are probably aware of Truman Capote's true crime novel In Cold Blood and the subsequent movie of the same name. If so, you met Perry Smith and Richard Hickok, the infamous pair who killed the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas on November 15, 1959, a little over a month before the Walker killings. It didn't take long for Sheriff Boyer to make a connection. He had Smith and Hickok's pictures published on the front page of the Sarasota Herald-Tribune. Police received a number of tips in response. At least 4 people said they'd seen the men 7 miles from the Walker home that day. In Nocatee, a town just east of Sarasota, 3 people said they'd seen the men asking directions to US 27, the road north, and commented that one of them had a scratched-up face. After they were caught, Smith confessed to the Walker murders, but Hickok denied their involvement. Police had nothing but circumstantial evidence to prove their theory. They couldn't match the pair's fingerprints to the scene of the crime. When the first DNA tests were run in 2007, nobody could find a match between the pair and the DNA either. Yet, the circumstantial evidence would continue to pile up against Smith and Hickok as the investigation continued. Remember that the Walkers had been out test driving cars on the day of the murder. One of the cars they test drove was a 1956 Chevy Bel Air. Well, Hickok and Smith were driving a similar vehicle. Perhaps the Walkers liked their car, and the murderous pair gained directions to the Walkers' secluded home. Perhaps they also gained an invitation inside by offering to sell their vehicle to the Walkers. Maybe even for less than the sellers in town were asking. This was despite Smith's insistence that they'd never been to Sarasota. However, a Miami Beach detective discovered that the day before the murders, the pair had checked in at a motel in Sarasota, paying $18 for a week's stay, but by the next morning, they'd vanished. When he was arrested in Las Vegas, Smith was carrying a pocket knife similar to the one missing from Cliff's pocket. Officers also found a toddler's shirt and a pink jacket beneath the car seat that could have matched Christine's dress. Police also found an army gas can and burlap bags that could have come from Cliff's military-style work jeep. But, as investigators would later find time and again, neither the Kansas nor the Las Vegas Police Department could locate any of that evidence anymore. After 6 decades, police agencies had destroyed or misplaced evidence possibly connected to the Walkers. Then there was the matter of a small circular print found in blood near Bonnie's body at the Clutter family Kansas murder scene. Perry Smith owned black engineer boots with a cat's paw rubber cushioned sole, featuring circular pads a little smaller than a quarter. His boots could have been a good match for that print, and however meager their belongings, the Walkers were robbed. Ironically, Smith and Hickok's motive for the Kansas Clutter murders was also robbery. By December 25, 1959, on Christmas Day, Hickok and Smith were in Louisiana. There, they sold 2 toy dolls to a minister for $1.50, which they used for gas money. The dolls were still wrapped in Christmas paper. Christine's younger sister, Novella Cascarella, herself a former law enforcement officer, still holds fast to the theory that Smith and Hickok were the culprits. She says the investigation was mishandled from start to finish and puts little stock in the failure to match fingerprints or DNA evidence. She also says that Christine was friendly and would have invited the 2 men in, had they claimed they were there to sell a car. This would have been consistent with the behavior their mother taught the sisters. She says that being strangers could have even worked in their favor, as they were brought up to be kind to outsiders. Also, the pattern of one of the murderers confessing, while the other denied, also matched the pair's pattern in the Kansas Clutter murders. Smith initially admitted to 2 of the Clutter murders, while Hickok denied killing anyone in the farmhouse. Later, Smith would try to confess to all 4 Clutter murders because he thought Hickok's mother was a lovely lady and he didn't want to break her heart. Smith was also an expert marksman by any definition, as he'd served in the Army, and was an accomplished hunter. Yet some remain unconvinced, including investigators and members of Christine's family. In addition to the lack of physical evidence, there were 1 or 2 other problems with laying all the blame at the feet of Smith and Hickok. For one, this would have been the first time that anyone suggested that there had been more than one murderer at the scene. For another, Perry Smith had strong feelings about rape. He'd stopped Hickok from raping Bonnie Clutter in Kansas. Why would he then allow Hickok to rape Christine? Is it possible that Hickok did the deed alone? prompting both men to flee town quickly? Or perhaps Smith confessed in order to continue his pattern of trying to spare Hickok's poor mother. What details do investigators know that might have led them to continue to doubt this theory? Do you believe that Smith and Hickok did the deed? Or is there more to this case than meets the eye? Smith and Hickok were the primary suspects in this case back in 2007, when the first DNA tests were conducted. Unfortunately, by this time, evidence had already been destroyed or misplaced. This included one of the earliest semen samples from Christine's underwear. There was loss of evidence in Kansas, Las Vegas, and Sarasota. Perhaps that is a natural thing to happen when so many decades pass, but it sure is frustrating. Regardless, the lost evidence and the more primitive DNA testing that existed in 2007 produced no matches, not between the DNA samples on file or for any of the suspects, including Smith and Hickok. And you won't believe what happened with the DNA. Detective Kimberly McGrath made an utterly heart-sinking discovery years later. She compared the supposed suspect's DNA with the incomplete DNA sample taken from Christine's dress. She realized they looked remarkably similar. In test after test, all of this time, police had been comparing the suspect's DNA to Christine herself and not to her killer. Finally, in 2023, after dozens of requests and years of waiting, investigators exhumed the body of Christine. Her remains were sent to an independent lab where they were able to isolate her DNA and separate it out from the DNA of the male suspects. Testing is now more sensitive and accurate, and scientists can do a great deal more with DNA than we could do in 2007. Investigators held their breath as they ran the correct DNA sample against Smith and Hickok's one more time. Nothing. No match. If DNA is meant to be conclusive, then evidence from the scene of the crime seems to suggest that the suspected killers were innocent of the Walker murders. And because we've had no arrests and the case isn't closed, the implication remains that no other suspect matched that DNA either. Sarasota law enforcement doesn't want circumstantial evidence. They want a DNA match before they're willing to call this case solved. Do you think they're being overly cautious and have missed an opportunity to give the families of this community peace and answers? Or do they know something we don't, something that makes it vital to insist on that match? Pat Myers is Christine's brother. He's never given up on the case. To this day, he hounds investigators, searches for answers, and hopes for some breakthrough, some development that will give him some peace at last. He doesn't believe Smith and Hickok killed his sister any more than Sarasota law enforcement seems to. Perhaps they're all right to doubt. Forensic psychologists have gone through the notes and the files and have concluded the killer most likely knew at least one member of the Walker family. That points the blame back at someone from the town, not at a famous pair of criminals. Cliff's hunting friend, Don McLeod, hasn't given up either. Not just because he lost his best friend that day, but because some of the neighbors and people in the town he's known his whole life still believe he committed the murders. That's despite a lack of evidence. And despite any reasonable theory that might place Don at that house at the time of the murders, he's been trying to clear his name ever since. But at this point, he suspects he'll die of old age before that happens. It seems that small-town rumor mills can be lasting and vicious. Meanwhile, law enforcement seems to be losing interest in this case. As suspects and family members alike die off from old age and other causes, the Walker case seems less urgent. Having set the standard of a DNA match, it looks less and less likely they'll ever receive the information they need to close the case. Perhaps the matching DNA is already 6 feet under, locked in the bones of a body that they will never legally be able to bring out of the earth. Perhaps the killer is someone nobody has even looked at yet. It's growing more and more likely that nobody will ever know for sure, including the people who need to know the most. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you have information that could help solve the Walker family murders, contact the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. My name is Vince. If you enjoyed this story, then you might like another of my stories involving the unsolved murder of the young Jameson family. In 2009, the Jameson family mysteriously vanished in the mountains of Oklahoma along with their dog. More than 4 years later, their bodies were found, but the circumstances surrounding their deaths remain a puzzle. Theories around their murders have been linked to foul play, drugs, and even cult activity.